So as I'm looking, I come across Love is Everything, and I'm going like, that says it all pretty much right there, because love is everything.
For more than 3 decades, George Strait didn't just make country music, he defined it. While trends shifted, sounds evolved, and artists came and went, Strait remained unmoved, standing firmly in a lane that felt timeless, honest, and unmistakably his own. The question lingered quietly in the background. What happens when the king steps away? Would the legacy fade? Or had it already taken root deeply enough to survive beyond him? Before we uncover what the future holds for the Strait family and what his son has now finally confirmed, we must first understand the man himself, the road he walked, and the values that shaped not just his music, but his entire life. Raised by Texas, shaped by quiet strength. George Harvey Strait was born on May 18, 1952, in the small town of Poteet, Texas, a place where life moved slowly and values were built through work rather than words. He was raised primarily in Pearsall, a town in Frio County, southwest of San Antonio, where wide skies, dusty roads, and ranch life formed the backdrop of his childhood. His father, John Byron Strait Sr., balanced 2 demanding roles: a junior high school mathematics teacher and a rancher managing a 200-acre spread outside Big Wells, Texas. From an early age, George learned responsibility not through lectures, but through labor. Weekends and summers weren't reserved for leisure. They were spent working cattle, fixing fences, and learning what it meant to show up regardless of the heat or exhaustion. These years quietly instilled the discipline and humility that would later define both his character and his career. When George was still in elementary school, his parents divorced, an event that reshaped the family dynamic in lasting ways. His mother relocated, while George and his brother remained with their father, growing up under his steady but demanding guidance. Life didn't become easier. It became more structured. Ranch work filled the gaps where comfort might have existed, and silence often replaced sentiment. Yet it was in this environment that George developed his calm demeanor, his grounded personality, and his instinct to let actions speak louder than words, traits that would later set him apart in an industry driven by flash and self-promotion. Music didn't enter George Strait's life with fanfare. It arrived quietly, almost accidentally, during his high school years when he joined a rock and roll garage band known as the Stoics. Like many teenagers of his era, his early influences came not from country radio, but from the British invasion, bands like the Beatles and other rock groups that dominated the airwaves. But something didn't quite fit. George didn't grow up glued to the radio. In fact, he often listened to the news or farmers' reports instead, absorbing the rhythms of everyday Texas life rather than chasing pop culture. His exposure to country music came largely through live performances, dance halls, town gatherings, and local shows, where music wasn't polished, but lived. Gradually, his musical taste shifted. He found himself drawn to artists who told stories rather than chased trends, voices that carried weight and emotion without excess. Musicians like Hank Williams, Merle Haggard, George Jones, Bob Wills, and Lefty Frizzell began shaping his musical identity, blending Western swing, honky-tonk, and traditional country into a sound that felt honest and deeply rooted. This wasn't imitation, it was absorption. George wasn't trying to sound like anyone else. He was quietly assembling a style that reflected where he came from, what he valued, and how he saw the world. 1 year from walking away. By the time George Strait reached college, music was no longer just a background interest. It was something quietly pulling at him, even when he refused to acknowledge it out loud. He enrolled at Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos, intending to study agriculture, a practical choice that aligned neatly with his ranching upbringing and his father's expectations. Music, at least at this stage, was still something he kept on the side, something personal rather than professional. That changed almost by accident. One day, Strait noticed a simple recruiting flyer posted around campus. A local country band was looking for a vocalist. There was nothing glamorous about it. No promise of fame or money, just an invitation to sing. George answered it without much thought, unaware that this small decision would quietly alter the course of his life. The band was called Stony Ridge, and from the moment he stepped in front of a microphone with them, something clicked. For the first time, Strait wasn't just playing music, he was finding his voice. As George grew more confident, Stony Ridge evolved into something new. He renamed the group Ace in the Hole, and before long, he had naturally assumed the role of band leader. They played wherever they could, smoky bars, dance halls, and small nightclubs scattered across South and Central Texas, sometimes driving hours for little more than gas money and a meal. Fame was nowhere in sight, but the music was real, and the crowds were slowly growing. The band's regional popularity earned them opportunities to open for established acts, including the Texas Playboys, and eventually caught the attention of a small independent label in Houston. That label gave them a chance to record several singles, including songs George himself had written. For the first time, his voice was preserved on vinyl. But the industry barely noticed. The records failed to gain traction. Radio stations ignored them, and national recognition remained painfully out of reach. By day, George worked cattle on his family's ranch to pay the bills. By night, he sang to crowds who loved him, but not enough to change his circumstances. The dream felt increasingly fragile. A glimmer of hope appeared through a bar owner named Irv Woolsey, a former employee of MCA Records. Woolsey believed in George's sound enough to invite record executives from Nashville to see him perform live. They came, they listened, they were impressed. And then they walked away. The reason was simple and devastating. They didn't think they could market his sound. His traditional Western-influenced style didn't fit the pop-leaning country trends dominating the industry at the time. For Nashville, George Strait was too country. The year that changed everything. After years of rejection, disappointment finally settled in. George reached a breaking point. Tired, discouraged, and convinced that the industry had no place for him, he told his band he planned to quit music entirely. Ranching offered certainty. Music offered only frustration. It was his wife, Norma, who stopped him. She didn't offer grand speeches or empty promises. She simply asked him to give it one more year. One final chance. If nothing changed, he could walk away, knowing he had truly tried. That year changed everything. In February 1981, George Strait signed a contract with MCA Records, but even then, the commitment was cautious. The label agreed to release just one single. If it performed well, an album might follow. If not, that would be the end. When MCA released Unwound, the results stunned everyone involved. The song climbed to number 6 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, a massive success for a debut artist with no pop crossover appeal. Suddenly, George Strait was no longer a risk. He was a revelation. The song was included on his debut album, Straight Country, which critics embraced as a breakthrough moment. At a time when country music was drifting toward pop, Strait's sound felt like a return home. Authentic, unpolished, honest. Country music had found its anchor. The decade that crowned a king. When Straight Country arrived, it did far more than introduce a promising new artist. It quietly signaled a shift in the direction of country music itself, arriving at a moment when the genre was drifting toward glossy production and pop-leaning sounds. George Strait's music felt different, not because it was trying to stand out, but because it refused to chase anything at all. His voice carried restraint rather than spectacle, and his songs felt lived in rather than manufactured, which is precisely why critics and fans immediately recognized Straight Country as something rare, a return to tradition that felt honest rather than nostalgic. He followed that momentum with Straight from the Heart in 1982. An album that confirmed his success was no accident, with Fool-Hearted Memory becoming his first #1 hit, and Amarillo by Morning emerging as a song that would forever be tied to his identity. It wasn't loud or flashy, but its quiet storytelling struck a deep chord, proving that emotion didn't need exaggeration to be powerful. George Strait wasn't reinventing country music. He was reminding it of what it had always been capable of when stripped down to its essence. In 1983, opportunity arrived unexpectedly when a scheduled headliner fell ill at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, and George Strait was asked to step in, a moment that would become one of the most defining chapters of his career. What began as a last-minute replacement turned into a tradition that lasted decades, as Strait returned to the rodeo year after year, eventually performing there more than 20 times and playing to over 1 million fans. The rodeo wasn't just another stop on a tour schedule. It became a symbol of his connection to Texas, to working-class audiences, and to a culture that valued authenticity over spectacle. Throughout the 1980s, the numbers spoke for themselves, as Strait accumulated 17 #1 hits in a single decade, including a remarkable run of consecutive chart toppers that cemented his dominance. Albums like Right or Wrong and Does Fort Worth Ever Cross Your Mind reached #1, with the latter earning CMA Album of the Year honors. Yet even as his commercial success soared, his musical approach never shifted. There were no trend-chasing experiments, no dramatic reinventions, just a steady output of songs that felt grounded, familiar, and deeply human. While others followed the market, Strait stayed the course, and in doing so, he became the standard. Stardom without spectacle. By the mid-1980s, George Strait had crossed a threshold that few artists in any genre ever reach, moving beyond mere success and into a space of true permanence, where his presence didn't just compete within country music, but actively defined it. He was no longer measured against his peers. He had become the reference point, the artist others were compared to when discussing what country music should sound and feel like. Awards followed naturally, including CMA Male Vocalist of the Year and multiple Entertainer of the Year honors, yet none of it appeared to alter his demeanor or shift his priorities. Fame did not inflate his ego or push him toward spectacle. Instead, it seemed to reinforce his instinct to stay grounded and let the work speak for itself. On stage, Strait remained almost defiantly understated, his delivery calm, precise, and unforced, his movements minimal, and his presence quietly commanding without ever demanding attention. There were no elaborate choreographed moments or dramatic gestures, only a man standing still, singing with clarity and confidence, trusting the strength of the song to carry the weight. That trust became one of his defining traits. He didn't perform at the audience. He invited them into the story, creating an intimacy that felt rare in increasingly image-driven performances. Songs like The Chair captured this perfectly, demonstrating his remarkable ability to communicate vulnerability and closeness without theatrics, allowing silence, phrasing, and restraint to create tension and release. Where other artists relied on volume, vocal acrobatics, or emotional excess, Strait relied on timing and honesty, understanding that sometimes what isn't said carries more power than what is. This approach didn't make him feel distant. It made him feel real, and fans responded to that authenticity in a way that bordered on loyalty rather than admiration. At a time when image was becoming increasingly central to commercial success, George Strait chose near invisibility outside of his music, avoiding controversy, limiting interviews, and drawing firm boundaries around his private life. He didn't cultivate mystery for marketing purposes. He simply believed that his life away from the stage didn't belong to the public. That restraint, rather than creating distance, drew fans closer, reinforcing the sense that what they heard on record was exactly who he was in real life, without layers of performance or persona. Despite the magnitude of his success, Strait remained deeply rooted in the life he had always known, returning to Texas whenever possible, continuing his ranching lifestyle, and maintaining a long-standing, deeply private commitment to his wife, Norma. Their relationship, built on mutual respect, shared history, and quiet loyalty, stood in stark contrast to the instability and excess that often accompany fame, becoming a living testament to the values that shaped him long before the spotlight arrived. Even as his career reached heights few could imagine, George Strait carried himself with the same calm, reserved presence he had as a young man working cattle alongside his father, uninterested in excess, spectacle, or external validation. His focus remained firmly fixed on his family and his music. Yet beneath that steady surface, life was preparing to test his resilience in ways no award, chart position, or sold-out arena ever could. As a devastating loss waited just beyond the horizon, ready to redefine strength in its most painful form. The loss that changed everything. Success has a way of convincing the world that nothing can break you, but behind the awards, the sold-out shows, and the growing legend, George Strait was about to face a loss so profound that no amount of fame could soften its impact. In 1986, at the height of his career, life delivered a blow that would permanently alter the man behind the music and reshape the way he moved through the world. Until that moment, George Strait had been known for his calm, steady presence, a man who carried himself with quiet confidence and emotional restraint. But nothing prepares a parent for the loss of a child, and nothing in his life had ever demanded that level of strength. On June 25, 1986, George and Norma Strait's world shattered when their daughter Jennifer was passed in a tragic car accident at just 13 years old. According to reports, the vehicle she was riding in overturned while making a turn, and she was not wearing a seatbelt. In an instant, the happiness the family had carefully built was replaced with a grief so deep it defied words. For George, the loss was unbearable, and the public would hear almost nothing from him about it. He did not give emotional interviews. He did not seek sympathy. He did not explain his pain. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with hardship. He retreated inward, choosing privacy over exposure and silence over spectacle. For years after Jennifer's death, George avoided the media almost entirely, conducting interviews only when absolutely necessary and refusing to allow his grief to become part of his public identity. The man who filled arenas night after night carried a heartbreak that few ever saw. And that restraint, rather than weakening his connection to fans, deepened it, as audiences sensed the weight behind his quiet demeanor, even if they didn't know the details. Although George Strait never openly spoke about his pain, it found its way into his music in subtle, unmistakable ways. Themes of loss, longing, endurance, and quiet resilience began to surface more frequently, not as dramatic confessions, but as understated reflections that allowed listeners to project their own experiences into his songs. He didn't write about tragedy directly, but the emotional gravity was there, carried in phrasing, tone, and restraint. His music became a place where sorrow and strength coexisted, where love was cherished because it could be lost, and where memories mattered because time was never guaranteed. Fans who had experienced loss of their own felt an unspoken connection, sensing that George wasn't just singing about emotion, he was living it. Rather than stepping away from music entirely, Strait leaned into work as a form of survival, not distraction, but structure. Touring, recording, and performing gave him routine at a time when life felt dangerously unstable. And through that routine, he found a way to keep moving forward without pretending the pain didn't exist. In the years following Jennifer's death, George Strait became even more protective of his family, drawing firmer boundaries between his public and private life. His marriage to Norma, already rooted in decades of shared history, became a source of strength, their bond deepened by grief rather than fractured by it. They chose to heal quietly, away from cameras and commentary, preserving what mattered most when everything else felt uncertain. Their son, George Harvey Strait Jr., known as Bubba, grew up largely shielded from the spotlight, raised with the same values that shaped his father: humility, discipline, and respect for privacy. George was determined that fame would not define his family or dictate their lives, and despite his growing legend, he remained present, grounded, and intentionally ordinary at home. This balance became one of the defining aspects of his legacy. While other artists were consumed by image, George Strait focused on being a husband and father first, allowing music to remain an extension of his life rather than its replacement. That choice, quiet and deliberate, preserved not only his family, but his sense of self. Records, restraint, and a legacy. Set in stone. As the years passed, George Strait did something almost unheard of in the modern music industry. He kept winning without changing, quietly defying the idea that longevity requires reinvention. While country music around him shifted toward pop country crossovers, flashy production, and image-driven stardom, Strait remained firmly rooted in tradition, releasing album after album that sounded unmistakably like him, music that felt grounded, familiar, and honest. He didn't chase radio trends or reshape his identity to stay relevant. Instead, relevance seemed to follow him, drawn by the consistency of his voice and the authenticity of his songs. His dominance never arrived in sudden explosions or viral moments, but rather through steady accumulation, year after year, until the sheer weight of his success became impossible to ignore. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the scale of George Strait's achievements had reached historic proportions, with #1 hits stacking up at a pace that felt almost routine, albums consistently achieving gold and platinum status, and his name becoming synonymous with reliability, quality, and endurance. What truly set him apart wasn't just the volume of his success, but its persistence, as he managed to place a top 10 hit every single year for 3 consecutive decades. A feat unmatched in any genre of music. In an industry defined by cycles of rise and decline, Where careers often peak quickly and fade just as fast, Strait's simply endured, unaffected by changing tastes or industry pressure. Yet despite holding records that placed him alongside legends like Elvis Presley and the Beatles in terms of gold and platinum certifications, George Strait never spoke or behaved like a man chasing history. He treated awards and chart positions as acknowledgments rather than destinations, milestones rather than motivations, remaining focused on the craft itself rather than the scoreboard that tracked his dominance. Success for Strait was never about proving greatness. It was about maintaining integrity, trusting the music, and letting time, not hype, decide what truly lasted. Beyond the stage, film, philanthropy, and Texas roots. George Strait's influence extended well beyond recording studios and concert stages, though he never sought to expand his brand aggressively or transform himself into a multimedia personality in the way many of his peers did. His reach grew naturally, carried by trust rather than promotion, and when he stepped into film in 1992 with Pure Country, it felt less like a career pivot and more like a quiet extension of who he already was. Portraying Dusty Chandler, a country singer disillusioned with fame and yearning for authenticity, Strait seemed to blur the line between fiction and reflection, embodying a character whose struggles mirrored his own careful relationship with stardom. The film allowed him to explore a broader musical palette without abandoning tradition, and its soundtrack, steeped in classic country and Western themes, went on to become one of the most successful releases of his career, further proving that his appeal transcended format while remaining rooted in sincerity. Away from the spotlight, Strait's sense of purpose revealed itself even more clearly through his commitment to causes close to his heart, particularly those supporting military personnel and wounded veterans. Having served in the U.S. Army himself, he carried a lifelong respect for service and sacrifice, choosing to give back not through grand public gestures, but through sustained, meaningful action. Alongside longtime friend and business partner Tom Cusick, he helped establish an annual invitational golf tournament and concert event in the Texas Hill Country, an undertaking that quietly raised millions of dollars for organizations dedicated to helping soldiers and their families. True to his nature, these efforts were rarely promoted by George himself, reflecting his belief that generosity didn't need attention to be sincere and that impact mattered more than recognition. Despite global fame and historic success, George Strait never left Texas behind. He continued to live there, maintaining his ranching lifestyle and holding tightly to a sense of normalcy that fame never managed to disrupt. Simple pleasures like golf, steer roping, and time spent outdoors remained essential to his balance, grounding him in the same rhythms that had shaped his character long before he became a household name. These routines weren't escapes from fame. They were reminders of who he was beneath it. When George Strait announced his retirement from touring in 2012, the news sent ripples through the music world not because it was shocking, but because it felt significant. This wasn't a dramatic exit fueled by exhaustion or decline, but a thoughtful decision made by a man who valued control over his own time, priorities, and legacy. He wasn't stepping away from music itself. He was redefining how it fit into his life. His farewell tour, The Cowboy Rides Away, became both a celebration and a collective moment of gratitude, drawing massive crowds who came not just to hear the songs, but to honor a career that had accompanied them for decades. The final show at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, shattered attendance records, becoming the most attended concert in North American history. A fitting send-off for an artist who had always let actions and results speak louder than announcements. Even after stepping away from the road, Strait never truly slowed down creatively. He continued to record, release albums, and collaborate selectively, proving that retirement for him meant presence rather than absence, more time with family, more control over his work, and the freedom to choose when and how he shared his music with the world. And quietly, behind the scenes, something else was taking shape, something fans had long suspected but never fully confirmed. A continuation of the legacy that would soon step into the light. The legacy lives on. For years, the question lingered quietly in the background of country music conversations, never asked too loudly out of respect, yet never fully dismissed either. When George Strait eventually stepped away, who would carry the spirit of pure country forward? Would the legacy simply end with him, preserved in records and memories? Or had it already been passed down long before anyone noticed? The answer, it turns out, had been standing nearby all along. Despite being the son of the most celebrated country artist of his generation, Bubba was never pushed toward the spotlight. Fame was never treated as an inheritance, and success was never assumed. Instead, he was raised with the same values that shaped his father: humility, discipline, and the freedom to choose his own path. That path initially led him not toward a microphone, but toward the rodeo arena. While studying at Texas A&M University, Bubba immersed himself in competitive rodeo, eventually becoming a professional roper with the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association. For years, he traveled, competed, and trained, embracing a demanding lifestyle that required grit, precision, and resilience. Rodeo wasn't a hobby for Bubba. It was a calling, one that aligned naturally with the values he had grown up watching his father live by. Even when a serious injury nearly ended his roping career, Bubba didn't retreat into privilege or expectation. He adapted, recalibrated, and quietly shifted focus, carrying with him the same determination that defined the Strait name long before it was famous. Though rodeo dominated his early adulthood, music was never absent from Bubba's life. Long before fans noticed him, his voice appeared subtly at the beginning of Heartland, the opening track of the Pure Country soundtrack, a quiet introduction rather than a declaration. As he grew older, Bubba didn't announce himself as an artist. He earned his place gradually, working behind the scenes as a songwriter. Over the years, Bubba co-wrote numerous songs with his father, contributing to albums such as Here for a Good Time, Love is Everything, Cold Beer Conversation, and Honky Tonk Time Machine. These weren't novelty collaborations or symbolic gestures, they were genuine creative partnerships built on trust, respect, and shared understanding of what country music was meant to sound like. On stage, the resemblance was undeniable. Cowboy hats, denim, boots, and an unspoken ease that felt inherited rather than rehearsed. When father and son performed together, it never felt like a handoff under bright lights, but rather a quiet acknowledgement that the tradition was already alive in the next generation. The moment it was finally confirmed. In 2014, during the final stop of the Cowboy Rides Away tour in Arlington, Texas, Bubba joined his father on stage in front of a record-breaking crowd, performing Arkansas Dave, a song Bubba had written himself. It wasn't a dramatic announcement, nor was it framed as a passing of the torch, but for those paying attention, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't the end of something. It was continuity. As years passed, Bubba remained deliberately private, avoiding social media, limiting public appearances, and choosing family life over public exposure. Married to his wife Tamara, and raising 2 children of his own, he mirrored the same values George had lived by: presence over publicity, substance over spectacle. Now in his 40s, Bubba has finally confirmed what fans long suspected. The Strait legacy was never about replacing George Strait, but about preserving what he stood for. Country music, in its truest form, doesn't need reinvention. It needs respect. George Strait never built his career chasing immortality, yet he achieved it by staying true to himself. His retirement from touring didn't signal an ending, but a transition, one that allowed space for reflection, family, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the work was complete. Through Bubba, that work continues, not as imitation, but as evolution grounded in the same principles: authenticity, restraint, and reverence for tradition. The legacy isn't loud, and it doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, much like the man who built it. In the end, George Strait didn't just leave behind records, awards, or sold-out stadiums. He left behind a way of doing things, a reminder that greatness doesn't need noise, and that sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones passed down quietly, through example rather than announcement. The king may have stepped back from the stage, but the music, the values, and the spirit of pure country ride on, steady, unbroken, and very much alive. If you enjoyed this story and want more deep dives into the lives behind the legends, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.